Once, a long time before the Ancient Ones, the first mortals to ever wander the world, began to fade away, a wanderer wandered westwards. Beyond where the farmland turned to oceans, beyond where the sea turned to sand, beyond where the sand reached the setting sun, beyond even where the setting sun could reach, the wanderer found a place where the air began to turn cold, and the 3 moons were her only company. She set a camp for the night near a fire pit, with the stones she could find as she huddled near the fire, her back to the mists in the west, and her face towards the setting sun in the east. Her stone pit is the first part of what we now know as the mausoleum. When the morning came, the sun was even further east, and the wanderer traveled further west, deeper into the mists. She found a shallow stream that marked the last of the sand before the world seemed to disappear into the mists. The stream that we now call the Stream of Souls, back then, it was barely a trickle of water through white pebbles. The wanderer's footsteps caused the stones to crunch like twigs as she passed through the stream into the realm of the dead. She knew she was no longer in the land of the living, because the air tasted like a tomb and seemed to sap life instead of provide it. Or at least she would have said it tasted like a tomb, if tombs had existed yet. In those days, the realm of the dead was empty. The Ancient Ones were still very much alive, and no one had yet discovered death. The wanderer traversed the realm of the dead for many days, trying to see what could not be seen. She found the great Umber plains that were back then were just clay soil. No bones, no shells, and no discarded armor to decorate the plains. Traveling even further west, she found where the Umbra plains met the shattered crags. Great mountains that had peaks so sharp it would cut the clouds and show alien stars to the wanderer. Collecting a great number of the crystals and ore from the shattered crags, the wanderer continued her walk even further westwards. The sun behind her was nothing more than a distant dot, brighter than any star in the sky, but not enough to light her path. Guided by the light of the 3 moons, she traveled past the shattered crags, which in those days had no bandits and had no beasts to hide from. The wanderer continued to travel deeper into the realm of the dead. She made it into the petrified forest, a forest filled with trees turned to stone, and yet continuing to grow as trees do. In those days, the petrified trees were barely saplings that could be easily crushed underfoot. Far from the petrified trees of today, which now stand higher in the clouds and had entire nations in their branches. Still, the wanderer tread carefully, because she did not understand the trees, nor any magic that they may have. Beyond the petrified forest, the wanderer found a river filled with flames that burned without heat. The great river of Phlegethon. Even then, it was impassable. So, the wanderer drew her cloak close to her face, to keep her concealed in shadow, as she followed the river north. Following the river of flames, she left the petrified forest to a grassland that grew wheat of all kinds. The grains grew plentifully, but resisted all attempts to harvest it by hand or by the wanderer's knife. So, she took some of the taller twigs of the petrified forest and exposed them to the fires of the Phlegethon, to have them fused together into a pole far longer than the wanderer was tall. Then she took the ores from the shattered crags and scooped the fire of Phlegethon with her own bare hands. The fire didn't burn like heat, but it still withered her hands into skeletal facsimiles of what they were. The ores purified and hardened into a metal sharper than any before or since. A mere flick of the wanderer's wrist, and her face fell into the fiery river. So sharp the blade was that she didn't even feel the pain of her now skeletal face. Another twist of the hands trying to get the blade onto the pole of petrified wood, and the forest was gone. Now she drew her cloak close to obscure her skeletal face as she took her new scythe, as she began to cull and cut the grain. Now the immortal and immovable grain was successfully reaped by the Wanderer's scythe, as she finally cooked the first food in the realm of the dead. Consuming her first fill of the bread of death, she filled her stomach, as for the first time since she crossed the stream of souls. The camp that the Wanderer built, where the petrified forest met the boundless range along the banks of the Phlegethon, would become the foundations of what we now know as the Strongfold, the first and the largest city in the realm of the dead. What would someday become soaring towers, flying buttresses, and floating palaces began as a fire pit, a hole in the ground, and a lean-to for a grim reaper. Now, filled with the wonders of the realm of the dead, the Wanderer began to travel east to the distant flickering star that was the sun. Using her scythe as a walking stick, she traveled back to the land of the living. Every step of the journey back was a struggle. The winds whispered to her as they pushed against her, promising her that she would be lord of all that she saw if she would only just stay in the realm of the dead. That failed, and she now navigated past the sharp shards of stone that was the petrified forest. The winds promised her that she would be able to hold stars more endless than the sands and brighter than the sun, if only she let the winds push her back just a few steps. When that failed, she continued past the Umbra Plains. Even when the clay clung to her feet and tried to pull her down, she continued her odyssey back to the living. As the ground tried to suck her down, she would strike down her scythe, making the ground still again, for even the ground feared the reaper's scythe. This would someday become the sun's road, for it would guide the dead to the stronghold in safety. Now, at the base of the mountain range of the Shattered Crags, the Wanderer began to climb the mountains. What were once simple trails that let her pass without issue were now nearly vertically covered in thorny brambles that would cut even a paladin's holy armor into mundane pencil shavings. The whispering winds, now yelling gales, pushed rocks and boulders into the Wanderer's path, trying to get her to stop, or at least slow down. As the Wanderer sliced both brambles and avalanches with a swing of her scythe, the winds yelled at her new promises. They promised to give her all the wisdom of the three moons, Nona, Decima, and Morta, if the Wanderer would stop only for a moment and rest. The wind would tell her the secrets. No hesitation in the Wanderer's thoughts or actions as she swung her blade and shattered the mountain range. Now the shattered crag was shattered. Most of the stones formed both the terrain and the creatures of the bereaved Badlands that now surround the shattered crag. The power from the Wanderer's blow was so great that even the wind and the clouds parted ways for the Wanderer, forming a halo of clear stars as she made her way across and began her final leg of the journey to the Stream of Souls. The winds scattered across the world now feared where the Wanderer stepped. Every step she took, even the breeze dared not to whisper. The clouds parted before her, and mist followed behind her, obscuring her skeletal hands and face as she walked slowly closer and closer to the sun that was now setting in the east. Standing on the western bank of the trickle that was the Stream of Souls, over the river, floating, was a creature unlike anything that the Wanderer had seen before. It was named the Screaming Horror. Made out of wind, teeth, and so many eyes, it stared at her, contemplating what she would do. The Wanderer struck her scythe down on the ground to grab the entity's attention. The eyes all focused on her. then her scythe, then on her hands on its scythe. It began to open its many mouths and spoke with all the voices of the world. In a cascading cacophony, it began to scream the final threats towards the wanderer. You cannot leave here. If you leave this place, you will bear a curse on yourself and everyone you bring here. The curse of mortality. You will carry with you the end of all things. All of your descendants will never know the nectar of immortality that you and your tribe have tasted. Everyone you bring here will be cursed, and the curse shall be carried by their children and their children's children until all of your realm is in mine. The entity grew in size, its teeth the size of houses, and the eyes larger than even the moons behind the wanderer. This will be my final offer. Stay in the realm of the dead, or you will become death, the entity warned her a final time. The wanderer considered for a moment, before lifting her scythe as she walked across the stream of souls. Each step she took, the entity howled in anguish. It dared not think of a human who would willingly give up immortality for curiosity. The entity's screams brought great pain to the wanderer, at least until she lifted her scythe, and for another strike, cut out the creature's many mouths. Now mute, it would only be able to stare at her as she strode across the water and into the realm of the living. The once screaming horror, now the silent horror, withdrew to its caves, where it would watch over all that happened, unable to warn what will happen, filling all the caves beneath the realm of the dead with its eldritch blood. The wanderer continued her journey east, where the sun was set, but she could not see anything to guide her. Wandering in the dark for a long time, she began to see a dim glow in the distance. With no other way to orient herself, she followed the dim light to the embers of her first camp. Despite all odds, despite how long she had been, and despite how cold the camp was, the embers still burned bright enough for her to see. Now, at her campsite, the wanderer made the fire larger and stronger, so that it would always burn. Then, as she waited for the sun to rise, she built a cabin around the fire, built from the very stone of the ground, cut by her scythe and sealed with her magic. In the morning, the cabin she built was large enough to hold hundreds of people. The wanderer named it the Mausoleum, because it would be a person's final resting place before the realm of the dead. Continuing her walk home, the wanderer continued to find her friends, and she would show them the realm of the dead that she discovered. She would warn all of them that traveling to the realm of the dead would mean there would be a point where they would live no longer. Most of the ancient ones were curious enough to explore the realm of the dead, cursing themselves and their family. A few, however, decided to live forever instead of satiating their curiosity. In time, the ancient ones who visited the realm of the dead began to die, some by natural causes, or by age, or by the hands of another. Most, after death, remembered how to get to the realm of the dead by themselves, but others needed help. So the wanderer, with a black cloak that covered her skeletal face, and a scythe that could cut anything, would guide them to the realm of the dead. In time, the only ancient ones left were the ones who had never seen the realm of the dead. Still, the wanderer would guide those descended from the first humans who chose curiosity over immortality to her realm. None had ever known immortality now, but all had known their curiosity. They would be explorers, inventors, writers and builders, heroes and villains. They would be the ones to live lives that would be creating things bigger than themselves, the ones who would seek to make the world better for the ones that came after them. The wanderer would look after these mortals with pride, as a mother looking after her own children. They all followed in her footsteps, often without even knowing it. In the end, all roads led to her realm. Even the words of the silent horror were now true. No matter how long the wanderer would live, no matter how many mortals she would guide across the stream of souls to her realm, she too would someday die and travel back to the realm of the dead. When the last thing in the world that can die dies, so too shall death die. And once that was done, the world's first mortal to live would become the last mortal to die.